Hello everyone. This is my video blog for the week 8 discussion. For this week, the research article that I found was an article by Terrell Strayhorn. I'm really interested I'm doing some research about arts students, and so I was very interested in self-authorship theory, and I wanted to find some kind of intersection between the self-authorship and the study of African American students, because one of the things that's happening at my university is some conversation around how do we help African students develop in arts disciplines. So that's one of the things that I was kind of interested in looking at. So I found this article that I thought was really interesting. It was called Singing in a Foreign Land, an exploratory study of gospel choir participation among African American undergraduates at a predominantly white institution. And again, I think that it has some resonance because I work at a predominantly white institution, and the institution that they researched sounds similar in many ways to mine. It's, for example, is a large southeastern university with over 30,000 students. Lots of opportunity for student involvement. So there are some resonances with the institution that I work at. Strayhorn places its research in the context of the fact that most black college students attend predominantly white institutions, but that their success rate, their persistence in graduation falls far below their white classmates. And so some of the reasons that he identifies for this might be a lack of a sense of belonging, the fact that many black students experience predominantly white institutions or PWIs as, quote, hostile, chilly, and unwelcoming environments. And that they face difficulty in adjusting to college environments that differ significantly from their culture of origin. They He also talks about how some of the research shows that involvement in campus clubs and organizations, especially with those where the participants come from, or they have same race peers, promotes academic success for African American students. But he also talks about how most of the research in this area focuses on traditional ways that institutions try to create support for those students. So things like financial aid programs, mentorship programs, academic support, academic advising, and what effect that has. But there's been very little research on sort of non-traditional activities, things like gospel choirs, that and what impact they might have for these students. So I mentioned that the research was conducted at a large institution. The subject pool were 21 students who sang in a gospel choir. They were mostly women. Came from a variety of class levels and majors, diverse family backgrounds, all identified as Christians, and most were in-state students at this institution. And through these qualitative interviews, a number of themes arose that Strayhorn identified that the students all talked about in terms of the impact of participation in this choir on their academic success. So one was that he found that the students talked about how participating in the choir helped them establish a sense of belonging on campus and reduce the feelings of marginalization that they might feel. So they talked about feeling like often outside the context of the choir, they felt alone, that they were just a face in a crowd, and participation in the choir helped the students sort of ease that feeling. A quote that really stuck out in my mind, again because I work with arts students, is one of the students said, "As a music major, I don't see black students in most of my theory classes, and there's only one black music professor, and he's part-time." And that's something that has real resonance for me because while we have a number of diverse students from diverse populations in our majors, our faculty are not. They don't reflect that, and so there's always this tension between where do students turn when they're looking for role models. The other thing that the students talked about in this study is that it sort of helped them ease their initial feelings of alienation. making the transition coming to a predominantly white institution. Another theme that the students talked about was how their involvement in this choir influenced the development of their ethnic identity and a sense of their ethnic pride. So it gave them opportunities to advance knowledge of Black culture, their knowledge of the Black culture and Black community on this predominantly white campus. And it also helped them learn about their own culture through the stories that the songs told. Which is one of the things that the director of the choir really focused on. The researcher also talked about how participation in this choir helped them derive support from various sources, particularly spiritual sources, things like family, friends, other members of the choir. And all of this contributed to a sense of resilience that the choir members felt. So the connection through their spirituality to the content of the songs help them identify sort of a connection with a higher power, which allowed them to deal effectively with challenges that they might face, interpersonal challenges, social challenges, or academic challenges. Interestingly, a number of the students in the study talked about how their participation in the choir improved communication and support from their parents. So parents would call them and ask how choir was going, and if they're going choir this week, and that really helped build relationships that were more constructive as they transitioned to the university level. And choir really became an extended family for many of the students. Interestingly, one of the students was a Black gay man, and he did not report that. So that sort of pointed out for the researchers that there is still some marginalization even in these ethnically based participate organizations, but that for most people, that choir really became a sense of extended family, which helped them face the challenges that they faced in going to a predominantly white institution. So Strayhorn drew a bunch of conclusions from those findings. One of them is that the members of the choir seem to negotiate their sense of belonging at their institution through the involvement in choir. So it helped them resolve the tensions that they felt as Black students in a predominantly white institution. And this had some resonance for me as I thought about self-authorship theory, where they talk about crossroads experiences, those places where something happens that forces a student to break away from formulas that they had relied on in previous experiences because they didn't apply, and helped them move towards sort of more self-authorship kinds of skills. I mentioned that the researcher talked about how participation in choir helped them to develop their own ethnic identity. And he pointed out that a lot of other research has shown that many African American students feel the pressure to represent their own culture to a predominantly white students and faculty around them can lead to further isolation and sense of negative pressure. But the students in this choir didn't feel that way. So he speculated that there was something about the fact that they voluntarily stepped into that role, that they assumed the responsibility of educating others about their own culture. That led them to feel differently about this experience. And that has some implications for practice that I'll talk about in a second. The other conclusion is that he felt that participation in this choir, helps students reflect on their experiences and draw upon inner strength and the relationships with other members of the choir and the support from parents and the others in order to help them be successful. And this sounds more like the students in this choir were drawing on those experiences to move toward more of the integration kind of phase of self-authorship skills, where students start to look at their experiences and draw upon their inner values to make some sense and make some meaning from those experiences. So I thought that was very interesting. The researcher pointed out some implications for student affairs practice that I think are well worth thinking about. The first is, and I'll read you a quote from the article: college student educators should acknowledge the role that ethnic student organizations, such as gospel choirs, play in facilitating students' engagement in educationally purposeful activities that promote cultural expression and positive development. I read another research paper when I was looking at self-authorship skills that talked about developmentally effective experiences. So the researchers interviewed students about the experiences that they had that they felt really moved them toward more self-authorship and more the integration phase of self-authorship. And they found that most of those experiences happened outside of the classroom. And that it seems like this kind of experience, the experience that these students were having in gospel choir, was really helping them move through those phases of self-authorship and to more to the integration phase. The author also encourages student affairs practitioners to talk with students about the issue of having to represent their ethnic culture to a predominantly white culture, and to encourage students to think about doing things like co-sponsoring events and collaborations with other Black or other ethnic groups on campus, and to offer diversity education programming through other venues on campus to kind of reduce some of the load that some Black students feel in having to educate people at a predominantly white institution about what their cultural experiences are. And I think that's a really valuable experience, especially as I think about my student affairs practice, to keep that in mind. Especially as students are expressing some frustrations with having to be the representative of their culture, or feeling that they're being pressured into being the representative of their culture. This article, I think, as I was reading the Sasson Davidis text and the Anum paper, had a lot of resonance with the stuff that came up in that article. So just a couple of things. I think Sasson Davidis talk about the need for curricular and developing curricular and leadership activities that demonstrate to students the value of their own histories and cultures as a way to overcome what they call the pervasiveness of whiteness on college campuses, and to deepen their academic engagement. And that's really what is at the core of this study of participation in gospel choirs. This also seems to be a way Sasson Davidis talk about offering culture-rich programming to enhance a sense of community, to help African American students find a sense of belonging and identity on common college campuses. And certainly this gospel choir seems to be one of those experiences that might, or one of those kinds of programming that might enhance this sense of community. The Anumba paper, I think, also had some real important things to say that related to the research in this study. They identified the need to build connections, and the students in their studies, I should say, talked about the importance and the need of building connections and support networks in order to increase their chance of being successful in college. And certainly the students in this gospel choir talked about that a lot, the fact that they could go to their peers, that they could explore the challenges through the content of the songs that they were singing, and help them apply those lessons to their work as college students. The students in the Anumba study also talked about the importance of being a role model, a leader, and a mentor, and how it was both being mentored by other people but also being a mentor for other students. And it seems like the students in this gospel choir really talked about that was an opportunity for them to share their culture, and by doing that, to be role models for others on campus. The students in the Anumba study also talked about the importance of family and institutional support, and that's something that came up in the study, in the Strayhorn study. The support from both inside and outside the classroom, and certainly the choir provided that outside the classroom, but the lessons the students took from the choir they could apply to their classroom behavior. and the importance of participating in clubs and organizations that create a supportive system of support for academic achievement. And that was another thing that a lot of the students in the Strayhorn study talked about. The fact that it helped them make social connections with students on campus when they couldn't easily find those because they felt like they were kind of lost on a predominantly white campus. So all of that led me to think about the scenario that Dr. Tolman gave us to create an initiative on campus to address, and I'm specifically looking at African American students and how you promote that. And it seems to me that one of the things this Gospel Choir article points out is the opportunity to possibly create some arts-based programming or activities for Black students to help them not only explore their own identity and the value and contributions of their history and their culture on campus, but also to negotiate that tension between having to constantly feel like they are representing their culture to a predominantly white culture, so that they can maybe more voluntarily step into that role, like the students in the gospel choir did. So I'm thinking about things like it would be really interesting to look at starting a storytelling company where African American students could explore their own stories and learn to tell their own stories in a way to create cross-cultural dialogue about these issues on a predominantly white campus. It would give them some value, create a space for the value of their own stories, but also allow them to take some control over the discussion of the value, what they bring to a campus in terms of diversity, and educate predominantly white culture about what that means and what their responsibilities might be. You might start a student theater company. There are a lot of action theater companies or educational theater companies that explore different issues. Maybe you develop some student work that explores the issues that students of color face when they come to predominantly white institutions and what that means, again, as a way of opening that cross-cultural dialogue in a predominantly white culture. There are all kinds of things that you could do with reading groups that look at the work of African American writers outside the context of a traditional literature classroom and what those stories mean in terms of students creating their own identity and an ethnic identity on a predominantly white campus. And in the visual arts, you could sponsor things like art competitions that help young artists and students not only explore their own feelings about these issues, but engaging a larger community in discussions about those issues. So that was my thought about an initiative that would be interesting to explore. I think sometimes the arts can open up doors like this in ways that other disciplines may not. So the question I have for members of the class, I'm curious if anyone knows any of these kind of non-traditional ways that institutions have tried to support African American student success. We hear a lot about mentorship programs. We hear a lot about tutoring programs and academic support systems. We don't hear a lot about non-traditional ways to do that. I'd just be really curious what's happening on other campuses. So I look forward to hearing from you, and thanks so much.